There was no farewell concert, no press release, no moment anyone could point to and call the last time. One day, Barbara Mandrell simply stopped appearing, even though she was the most powerful woman in country music. 3 consecutive years as Entertainer of the Year. A face everywhere on American television. An artist everyone believed could do it all. And then, she stopped. Not because she failed, not because the love ran out, but because there was something the public had never seen. The limit of a human being who had been forced to stay strong for far too long. This story does not begin with an accident. It does not begin with fame. It begins with a childhood that left no room for exhaustion, and it ends with a decision very few people in entertainment ever dare to make, choosing to step away from the spotlight while the spotlight still wants you to stay. Barbara Mandrell was not just a country star. She became one of the hardest questions success can ask. If you could go even farther, but the price was yourself, would you keep going or would you stop? That is the journey we are about to take together. Barbara Mandrell was born in 1948 in Houston, Texas, but her childhood was never tied to any fixed home. Her family performed on the road across America. Long drives replaced backyards, cramped backstage rooms replaced classrooms, and applause became the earliest measure of what was right and what was wrong. For Barbara, the stage was school, and the highway was home. Every evening came with a show to perform. Every morning required readiness. There was no concept of a day off, and no space for laziness or trial and error. From a very early age, she learned a simple but unforgiving rule: perform well, and you stay. Perform poorly, and you are replaced. There was no normal childhood to return to when exhaustion set in. No quiet space to ask herself what she liked or wanted. Instead, a survival mechanism formed early, quietly. Persistently. Self-worth became inseparable from fulfilling one's role. Play the instrument well, sing on cue, smile at the right moment. Don't inconvenience anyone. Don't slow the convoy down. That pressure was rarely named because it did not look like violence or deprivation. It was the invisible pressure placed on a child praised for always doing things right. Be good, be capable, stay on rhythm, and most importantly, do not get tired. That imprint followed Barbara throughout her life. It showed in her command of the stage, in her iron discipline while performing, and even in how she faced herself away from the spotlight. Her music was always polished, precise. Her life appeared the same. But that very precision, over time, placed a weight on her shoulders that only much later would her body begin to protest. Barbara's childhood was not loud, nor tragic in the conventional sense. It simply lacked one deeply human permission: the right to be tired. And from that absence, at the shape of the person who is not allowed to stop, slowly took form, quietly, relentlessly, and seemingly without an end point. Barbara Mandrell did not come to music through glittering dreams. For her, it was simply the only path to survival, something learned, drilled, and assumed from an early age. While others weighed their options, Barbara was already on the road, carrying her instruments and the discipline of someone with no backup plan. The early years held no glamour. She played as a hired musician, sang background vocals, stood behind the spotlight of others, doing whatever was necessary to keep the stage running. There, Barbara learned how to listen, how to adapt, how to make herself the steady element in a constantly shifting world. No one called it shining. It was musical labor, persistent, quiet, with no demand to be seen. That very versatility became a double-edged sword. Barbara was seen as someone who could do everything, but lacked a clear identity. In a market that favored neat labels, she was too flexible to be boxed in. Not rebellious, not tragic, not noisy, just an artist so reliably effective that she was easy to overlook. Then the moment shifted. Country music entered a phase that required a new kind of female presence, traditional enough to be trusted, modern enough to expand boundaries. Someone who could stand between multiple spaces, radio and television, stage and living room, music and mainstream entertainment. Suddenly, the qualities once dismissed as unclear became strengths. Barbara's recognition did not arrive with an explosion. It came when the era finally caught up with the person. When country needed flexibility, Barbara was already prepared. When audiences needed a face capable of carrying music farther, she was already there, with experience, discipline, and a quiet flame that had never gone out. By the late 1970s, every piece of Barbara Mandrell's life began to fall into place, not by chance, but as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Country radio was filled with songs carrying a new kind of energy, sleeping single in a double bed. If loving you is wrong. I Don't Want to Be Right, Years. Tracks that were traditional enough to earn trust, yet modern enough to reach audiences beyond the boundaries of pure country. The culmination was I Was Country. When country wasn't cool, not merely a hit, but a declaration of identity at a time when country music itself was in transition. But Barbara's success did not stop at radio. She stepped onto television and stayed there. Barbara Mandrell and the Mandrell sisters brought her into the living rooms of millions of American families every week. On the live stage, she did not simply sing. She played instruments, drove the rhythm, and commanded the space like someone who understood the stage down to its internal structure. For a rare stretch of time, Barbara achieved what very few female country artists ever had. Dominating radio, dominating television, and dominating live performance, all at once. Awards followed as a consequence. For multiple consecutive years, Barbara was honored as CMA Entertainer of the Year, a title traditionally reserved for male artists with mass appeal. But for Barbara, this recognition was more than validation of talent. It was proof that country music had embraced a new model, a woman not standing at the margins, but placed at the very center of the entertainment engine. At that point, Barbara Mandrell was no longer simply a singer. She became a flawless performance machine of the mass entertainment era. Always on time, always precise, always radiating energy. No mistakes, no missed beats, no empty spaces. And it was right here that a new pressure began to form. Quietly. When everything runs too smoothly, when the image of being incapable of error becomes fixed, each night on stage is no longer just a performance. It becomes a test. How much longer can you maintain perfection? Barbara's success reached its summit, but inside, the cost of always being right was beginning to take shape. Away from the spotlight, Barbara Mandrell maintained a long and enduring marriage with Ken Dudney, her partner since the early years of her career. On paper, it was a rare picture of stability in the entertainment world. But behind that stability was a life rhythm constantly stretched tight by touring schedules, television tapings, and commitments that allowed no slowing down. Barbara's family lived at a pace they did not choose. Time was broken into segments measured by tour dates, broadcast hours, and back-to-back flights. There were no loud tragedies, no crises for the press to latch on to, only the quiet absence of ordinary moments. dinners with everyone present, evenings that did not revolve around a clock, days that did not require preparation for what came next. When she became a mother, one question began to surface more clearly. Not before the public, but in a deeply private space. If I stop, do I still have value? It was not the fear of losing fame, but the fear of losing the very survival mechanism she had carried since childhood, being loved because she was always in motion. Motherhood made the distance between stage and home impossible to ignore, because at home, there is no applause to confirm that you are doing things right. Offstage, Barbara was a reserved, disciplined woman, rarely speaking about her emotions. She did not turn her private life into a story. She did not complain. She did not explain. Everything was kept contained, the same way she kept her performance tempo, precise, controlled, without excess. And so, the absence in Barbara's personal life was not marked by scandal. It was marked by time not spent, something no one condemns, yet no one can ever give back. And within that space, a quiet tension continued to build. A slowly wearing things down, preparing the ground for a turning point that, for now, no one had yet named. Some tragedies do not arrive as a single moment of collapse. They accumulate, slowly, steadily, and in silence. For Barbara Mandrell, exhaustion never took on a dramatic form. It did not erupt into scandal, nor did it become a mysterious disappearance. Instead, it revealed itself through a life that continued to run with unsettling smoothness. A packed performance schedule, regular tapings, a smile delivered on cue. The machine was still running. Only the engine had been overheating for far too long. The pressure to always be right had been building for years. Right on rhythm, right in image, right in expectations, right in the role of the woman who could do everything. When perfection becomes the standard, fatigue has nowhere to go. It gets pushed downward, forced into the background, waiting for another moment to speak. That moment arrived in 1984 through a serious car accident, a traumatic brain injury, lasting physical damage, pain that did not fade after a few weeks of recovery. The accident did more than injure her body. It exposed what had been hidden for far too long, a body pushed beyond its limits, a mind conditioned to believe it was never allowed to stop. For the first time in many years, Barbara was forced to slow down, not by choice, but because there was no other option. During recovery, a chain of causes began to reveal itself in a profoundly human way. A childhood organized too early leads to uninterrupted years of stardom, leads to a family forced to adapt to performance rhythms, and finally the body speaking on behalf of emotions that had never been given space. This was not a cinematic turning point. There was no grand awakening, no powerful declaration, only a quiet realization. The old version of Barbara, the one who was not allowed to be tired, could no longer survive. That undercurrent did not destroy everything at once, but it created fractures, deep enough that from this point forward, every decision would no longer be the same. There was no scandal for the press to chase, no ruined performance, no public fall for anyone to point at. Barbara Mandrell's collapse unfolded in a far less visible way, through a quiet decision made while everything on the outside still appeared to function perfectly. The touring schedule could have continued. The audience was still there. Fame had not faded, but inside, a limit had been reached. After the accident and the long years of recovery that followed, Barbara began to understand that she was no longer standing on stage with the same body, the same inner reserves as before. Every continuation was no longer just a performance. It was a trade-off, A trade-off of energy, of presence with her family, of the chance to preserve a part of life not entirely consumed by the spotlight. In 1997, Barbara Mandrell stepped away from performing. No grand announcement, no carefully staged farewell. She simply stopped, while she still had the stature to continue and the clarity to understand what would be lost if she did not. That decision did not come from boredom, nor from failure. It came from a deeply human fear. If she kept going any farther, there would be nothing left to hold on to, for her family and for herself. For someone who had long been valued through her ability to please others, disappearing from the stage was not an act of escape. It was a breaking point. The moment Barbara chose to draw a boundary instead of continuing to prove herself. No one called it a collapse, but it was here that the shape of her life quietly began to change direction. After stepping away from the spotlight, Barbara Mandrell entered unfamiliar territory, a place where fame no longer served as a protective layer. There were no performance schedules to cling to, no production rhythm to mask the silence. Days were no longer divided by airtime, but by what her body could handle and how much patience she could summon. She had to face a reality that was difficult to name. Her body was different. Her memory was different. Pain arrived without warning. Focus no longer held the way it once had. Things she had previously done instinctively now had to be relearned, slowly, carefully, with no audience to applaud when she got it right. Family became her anchor, but also her final test. Without the spotlight, relationships were forced to stand on their true value. There was no longer career demands to justify absence, no schedule to postpone being present. Here, Barbara learned how to show up, not as a performer, but simply as someone who is there. What stands out is that she did not return through cheap nostalgia. She did not capitalize on past glory. She did not sell memories as a product. Barbara's silence was not the result of a lack of opportunity, but a clear choice, not to turn her past into a crutch for moving forward. In those years of feeling her way through the unknown, a new skill slowly took shape, learning to live slowly. For Barbara, this was the hardest skill of all, slowing down without feeling guilty, staying still without needing to prove anything. I'm allowing a day to pass without having to be on rhythm for anyone. The scars did not disappear, but they pushed her toward a different pace of life, one where value is no longer measured by speed and presence does not require a spotlight to be acknowledged. Barbara Mandrell's continuation did not take the form of a comeback. She appeared rarely, deliberately, in the right moments and the right places, enough to remind people she was still there, but never enough for the spotlight to pull her back into the old rhythm. No more tour after tour. No schedules dictated by the expectations of a crowd. More importantly, Barbara no longer chased recognition. The symbolic role that once placed her at the center of radio, television, and the stage gradually moved behind her personal life. Her choices were no longer about responding to others, but about preserving her own rhythm. When her body needed rest, she rested. When she needed quiet, she chose quiet. Health was placed above fame, not as a slogan, but as a new habit. Small decisions repeated daily, choosing to stay home rather than appear, choosing presence over performance. In that space, Barbara found a different kind of freedom. Freedom from the need to prove. Her post-crisis philosophy of life is therefore remarkably simple. Not everyone who stops has failed. Some journeys are only complete when you know when to slow down, when to stand still, and when to leave the stage before the stage leaves you. Barbara did not turn silence into a statement. She allowed it to exist as a choice, quiet, sustained, a living reminder that continuation does not always mean moving forward. Sometimes continuation means holding on to what still matters. When looking back at Barbara Mandrell's journey, her legacy is not defined by how many additional hits country music gained. It lies in how the image of the country woman was reshaped after she appeared. Before Barbara, female country artists were often placed within narrow frames. Emotional vocalists, gentle images, standing beside a band or behind someone else's spotlight. Barbara stepped outside that frame. She played instruments, led the stage, controlled the rhythm, and commanded the performance space as a center of authority, without borrowing an image or relying on symbolic backing. Major honors, Grammy Awards, CMA and ACM recognition, and her induction into the Country Music Hall of Fame officially affirm a period when she stood at the summit. But those are only the surface. What matters more is the standard Barbara left behind. A female artist has full authority on stage, not merely invited to appear, but allowed to stay, to lead, and to shape the form itself. And, when the time came to stop, Barbara opened another precedent, no less rare. She showed that artists not only have the right to shine, but also the right to step away when necessary, not to attract attention, not to manufacture a myth, but to protect the part of life that can no longer be given to the spotlight. Barbara Mandrell's legacy beyond awards rests here. The right to stop without asking permission, the right not to prolong glory in order to prove worth, and the right to be remembered not only for what was done, but for the boundaries she dared to draw. In an industry that constantly urges more, longer, brighter, that choice was quiet, yet profound. And it is precisely that choice that became the most enduring mark Barbara Mandrell left behind. Barbara Mandrell's story does not close with a new victory, nor does it end in a tragedy dramatic enough to demand a backward glance. It settles, much like the rhythm of life she chose after the spotlight shifted. No need for another peak to prove anything. No need for a comeback to be remembered. Just a person who traveled far enough to understand this. There are values you cannot carry with you if you keep going forever. Looking back on the entire journey, the question that remains is not meant only for Barbara Mandrell. It is meant for anyone who has ever stood at the line between continuing and stopping. If you could keep going, but knew the cost would be yourself, what would you choose? If this story made you reflect, leave a comment below. And subscribe to the channel to continue with other journeys, the stories behind the spotlight, where human value is seen most clearly.